Yo, so I'm sure you probably heard by now, but power has been out in Venezuela for several days now, and it continues. And this is another crisis on top of crises that have been more or less caused by the United States and the CIA, various backed operatives, the usual. And the electricity thing is persistent and ongoing and is causing a lot of social upheaval, unrest, the like. And this morning I heard, okay, so this report from ABC News, they're like a shining beacon of fantastic journalism, which is to say they, they're not at all. They're talking about people who are consequently suffering in hospitals because of a lack of electricity, which that is indisputable. If there isn't electricity, people are going to suffer for sure. But that's the point. Now, as to who is responsible for this, that's up to debate at this point, but your corporate media journalists aren't going to do a lot of digging to find that out. As you will hear in this clip from ABC News that I'm going to play, it's confounding. So, corporate media in general shits on Trump most of the time, right? They call him crazy, horrible, similar synonyms, stuff like that. And yeah, I'll agree with that for the most part. And, they always talk about how he can't be trusted, these sorts of things, and how everyone he's appointed, is also pretty much horrendous. That's been the theme since he was inaugurated. But it's seriously mind-blowing. I mean, I understand that how corporate media works, and I'm sure that you do too. It's mostly to push a certain narrative, the whole manufacturing consent thing that Noam Chomsky has discussed at length. And it's to push a certain narrative, and more or less, as Jimmy Dore has said, and many other people, Chris Hedges as well, these people in the media are stenographers to power, and that's readily obvious. But it's very interesting how, when it comes to foreign policy, these corporate media outlets who like to shit on Trump a lot and, needle at him for his incompetence and what have you, will just take the word of his administration. And, I mean, honestly, it's kind of laughable. Like, I actually laughed, but it's a dire situation, obviously. So, check this out.
In the dark, the crippling blackout continues there, a desperate situation growing worse. Tonight, our team inside a hospital where the power is out and families now across Venezuela say their loved ones are paying with their lives. Tonight, the U.S. now responding to claims from the Venezuelan president that the U.S. could be behind the blackout. ABC's Tom Llamas is in Venezuela again tonight.
Tonight, Venezuela's most needy, trying to stay alive in hospitals just like this one, with little or no power.
So you can see this is the situation here in some hospitals in Caracas. There is no power. This is a private hospital. They do have a generator, but it's not enough power to power the entire floor at times. You can see patients are being wheeled out in the dark. This is the reality in Venezuela.
Guiding us through this dark maze, the hospital's ER chief. The facility invited us in to see the desperation. Parts of the hospital relying on a generator, but they have to conserve power to keep patients like Romero Andrade alive. Since the nationwide blackout 6 days ago, he's been in a coma, battling colon cancer. His daughter tells me they were treating him using flashlights. The director of the hospital telling me they are running out of time. Already, they've sent some patients home.
I have 67 years. Never in my life I have seen something like this.
All of this as reports of stores being looted while families scavenge for food and water anywhere they can. The crisis on full display right through the center of Caracas. Families getting water from this polluted river. President Maduro is blaming the United States, without proof accusing U.S. hackers of sabotaging their electrical grid, crippling the nation, and leading to chaos.
And so let's bring in Tom Llamas reporting from Venezuela tonight. And Tom, first off, what's the reaction from the Trump administration tonight about these claims from President Maduro that the U.S. could be behind the blackout? And secondly, are U.S. diplomats leaving as they've been told to do?
Well, David, first, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the U.S. played no role in the collapse of Venezuela's electrical grid. He says the real culprit is Maduro's, quote, incompetence. Now, the U.S. is taking no chances here in Venezuela. They are pulling out all U.S. personnel. And Secretary Pompeo says it's because of the deteriorating situation here in Venezuela. And, David, we have seen it everywhere since we've been here, from people taking baths in that river of filth to mothers carrying large jugs of brown water to the darkened hospitals. Even the airport still has no power, David.
All right, Tom Llamas, great to have you back in Venezuela to put a spotlight on this desperate situation.
This kind of reminds me of some work that John Pilger did. He is probably one of the absolute best journalists of the last century, in my opinion, and probably in the opinion of a lot of other people as well. He did some work on embedded journalism about how, for instance, when journalists go overseas, or like let's say that a journalist was going to Afghanistan, like 10 years ago or something maybe. So they'll go overseas, and so technically they're going to the source. So that's what you should do in order to be able to adequately report instead of taking someone else's word for it. You want to be a primary source instead of a secondary source. Now, the issue with embedded journalism, though, is a reporter tends to go over there, and then they end up being met by members of the military, and they're shown around, escorted around, drive around with members of the military. So they are shown what the military wants them to see. So it's a very controlled sort of issue. So they might be actually seeing certain things, but they're receiving a certain narrative, and what they're seeing and what they're experiencing, and just the entire thing is very controlled. And so this is an issue for a lot of reasons, and I would highly encourage you to go check out John Pilger's work on that on his website. But this guy that is supposedly, well, I mean, he actually is, from ABC News in Caracas. It's just interesting how, if he's actually there in this report specifically, he only talks for, 30, 40 seconds or something like that. You never hear any other perspective from corporate media, so that should always set off your alarm bells. But I would want to investigate and hear other differing perspectives, talk to just as many people as I could to try and get a grasp on all the different perspectives going on, and then be able to try and report these different vantage points. But obviously, we know that's not how the game works here. So there is a lot of debate, I guess, over who's responsible for this power outage. Now, I know what I think, and you're welcome to think what you think, but there are a lot of actually good investigative journalists and reporters who have been in Venezuela off and on over the past several months, as the United States has been fomenting a lot of upheaval, social unrest, and a lot of opposition there by trying to encourage or implement various crises. So losing electricity is a pretty big one. One important thing to consider that could give some validity to Maduro and his administration saying that the U.S. is responsible for this power outage is that WikiLeaks revealed, I think it was under Vault 7, that the CIA has the appropriate tools in order to hack something, change the signature on it, and make it appear as if it was someone else who was responsible for it, basically to remove traces of U.S. involvement, frame somebody else, or just make it anonymous, more or less. So that's something to consider here. I don't know if it's applicable or not, but obviously the United States and the intelligence agencies have the capability to do something like this if they so chose to do that. But Max Blumenthal did some work there and put out an article on this yesterday that provides a lot more insight than ABC does, which, imagine that. So this is from Max Blumenthal in the Greyzone Project from March 11th, 2019. This article is entitled, U.S. Regime Change Blueprint Proposed Venezuelan Electricity Blackouts as, quote, watershed event, unquote, for, quote, galvanizing public unrest, unquote. And the subhead is, The U.S.-funded Canvas organization that trained Juan Guaido and his allies produced a 2010 memo on exploding electricity outages and urged the opposition, quote, to take advantage of the situation towards their needs, unquote. Now, I'll link this article. I know you guys probably know how to read, so I won't read it all to you, but I do encourage you to check it out. So he more or less is discussing how the likelihood of this power outage being organic or a result of the incompetence or inadequacy of the current administration in Venezuela is slim, and he provides evidence to back up his claims and at least provides sources for people to consider that it's not just because Maduro is really, really incompetent. I think that's pretty much what's being espoused, more or less, in the typical narrative. But this article starts and he says, a September 2010 memo by a U.S.-funded soft power organization that helped train Venezuelan coup leader Juan Guaido and his allies identifies the potential collapse of the country's electrical sector as, quote, a watershed event, unquote, that, quote, would likely have the impact of galvanizing public unrest in a way that no opposition group could ever hope to generate, unquote. Now, this is very reminiscent of Naomi Kline's The Shock Doctrine, where you have some catastrophic event that is therefore a catalyst to usher in a lot of different sorts of crackdowns on freedoms or passing different legislation just while the public is in fear, while they're panicking, while they aren't paying attention to what's occurring, assuming the media is even reporting it, is an excellent time to try to take advantage of it in whatever way politicians may want to do. So in this instance, the whole overthrow of Venezuela's government isn't really going as quickly as the neoconservatives would like it to. That much is pretty clear. So this is an event that just occurs and then can be seized upon to try and usher in whatever they want to have done. And regardless of whether or not you support Maduro or if you support, I guess, Guaido or whoever the fuck you might support as a Venezuelan, having no electricity is a fucking problem, regardless of whose fault it is. And you just want that shit back on. So obviously this is just a huge catalyst, and the first paragraph of this article obviously is, stating that. So let's go on. The memo has special relevance today as Guaido moves to exploit nationwide blackouts caused by a major failure at the Simon Bolivar hydroelectric plant at Guri Dam, a crisis that Venezuela's government blames on U.S. sabotage. It was authored by Sergio Popovich of the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategies. Acronym is CANVAS. A Belgrade-based, quote, democracy promotion, end quote, organization funded by the U.S. government that has trained thousands of U.S.-aligned youth activists in countries where the West seeks regime change. This group reportedly hosted Guaido and the key leaders of his Popular Will Party for a series of training sessions, fashioning them into a Generation 2007 determined to foment resistance to then-President Hugo Chavez and sabotage his plans to implement 21st century socialism in Venezuela. In the 2010 memo, Canvas's Popovich declared, quote, a key to Chavez's current weakness is the decline in the electricity sector, end quote. Popovich explicitly identified the Simon Bolivar hydroelectric plant as a friction point, emphasizing that, quote, water levels at the Guri Dam are dropping, and Chavez has been unable to reduce consumption sufficiently to compensate for the deteriorating industry, end quote. Speculating on a, quote, grave possibility that some 70% of the country's electricity grid could go dark as soon as April 2010, unquote, the Canvas leader stated that, quote, an opposition group would be best served to take advantage of the situation and spin it against Chavez and towards their needs, unquote. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that the United States tried to implement a coup in 2002 under George Bush's administration against Hugo Chavez and oust him from leadership. And it failed, as you know. And so, obviously, this is a very familiar routine. One thing to consider, and I'm sure many people have pointed this out, is that there are a lot of people who were high-level players in George W. Bush's administration who have been ushered in again under the Trump administration, John Bolton being one of the leading figures. And so, since it failed then, you see the same people reemerging and who have been placed into their positions, and they're basically just repeating the same thing. So, this is not a surprise, but just something to consider. So, in this article, Max Blumenthal goes on and says, flash forward to March 2019, and the scenario outlined by Popovich is playing out almost exactly as he had imagined. On March 7th, just days after Guaido's return from Colombia, where he participated in the failed and demonstrably violent February 23rd attempt to ram a shipment of U.S. aid across the Venezuelan border, the Simon Bolivar hydroelectric plant experienced a major and still unexplained collapse. Days later, electricity remains sporadic across the country. Meanwhile, Guaido has done everything he can to, quote, take advantage of the situation and spin it, unquote, against President Nicolas Maduro, just as his allies were urged to do over 8 years before by Canvas. I'm also sure that most of you guys are probably aware that one of the key and leading figures this time around, pushing for quote-unquote regime change in Venezuela and trying to push Guaido and completely axe the existing government is Marco Rubio. And my God, he has been brazen. When he tweeted that photo of Gaddafi being murdered and was referencing Maduro and like basically saying, this is what's going to happen to you, which is an outright death threat. And that's, a huge issue in and of itself. He's been pushing for this and been in the public eye, tweeting and what have you, just adamant about it. It's important to keep in mind that Sheldon Adelson is the one pulling the strings. He basically, his two biggest bitch boys are Trump and Rubio. He contributed, I think, $20 million to Trump's campaign, and he's also a huge backer of Rubio. And so that's just something to keep in mind about who is pulling the strings behind the scenes. So Blumenthal goes on here, and you've got a subhead now that says, Rubio vows, quote, a period of suffering, unquote, for Venezuela hours before the blackout. The Venezuelan government has placed the blame squarely on Washington, accusing it of sabotage through a cyber attack on its electrical infrastructure. Key players in the U.S.-directed coup attempt have done little to dispel the accusation. In a tweet on March 8th, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo framed the electricity outage as a pivotal stage in U.S. plans for regime change. But I'm sure he thinks he's clever. He tweeted, Maduro's policies bring nothing but darkness. Wow, how profound. And then he tweeted, no food, no medicine, now no power, next no Maduro. Oh man, look at him. Wow. A wordsmith. Wow. Another thing to keep in mind is that Pompeo is a huge Koch brothers stooge. He's one of their key players. And unfortunately, he got his roots in politics over in Kansas, which I live really close to state line, so not proud of that shit. Okay, so Blumenthal continues and says, at noon on March 7th, during a hearing on Venezuela at the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee, Senator Marco Rubio explicitly called for the U.S. to stir, quote, widespread unrest, unquote, declaring that it, quote, needs to happen, unquote, in order to achieve regime change. Venezuela is going to enter a period of suffering no nation in our hemisphere has confronted in modern history, Rubio proclaimed. Around 5 p.m., the Simon Bolivar hydroelectric plant experienced a total and still unexplained collapse. Residents of Caracas and throughout Venezuela were immediately plunged into darkness. At 5:18 p.m., a clearly excited Rubio took to Twitter to announce the blackout and claim that, quote, backup generators have failed, unquote. It was unclear how Rubio had obtained such specific information so soon after the outage occurred. According to Jorge Rodriguez, the communications minister of Venezuela, local authorities did not know if backup generators had failed at the time of Rubio's tweet. Back in Caracas, Guaido immediately set out to exploit the situation, just as his canvas trainers had advised over 8 years before. Taking to Twitter just over an hour after Rubio, Guaido declared, "The light will return." Basically, yeah, the light will return when Maduro's gone. Wow, imagine that. Okay. Like Pompeo, the self-declared president framed the blackouts as part of a regime change strategy, not an accident or error. 2 days later, Guaido is at the center of opposition rally he convened in affluent eastern Caracas, bellowing into a megaphone, "Article 187 when the time comes. We need to be in the streets, mobilized. It depends on us, not on anybody else." Article 187 establishes the right of the National Assembly, quote, to authorize the use of Venezuelan military missions abroad or foreign in the country, unquote. Upon his mention of the constitutional article, Guaido's supporters responded, "Intervention! Intervention!" Now, there's more to the article, but I won't keep reading it to you because you can read it on your own if you'd like, and I'm sure it'll read better if you read it instead of me. So these are just some things to consider, and very likely not anything that you're going to see on your typical media outlet, corporate media outlet. You're not really going to hear any other side to this story. Most things I've seen have said something like, Maduro's government says that the United States is, that they're blaming the U.S. for the power outage, and then there's something like the next clause of the sentence is without any proof or whatever, which, that it's funny they should say that because they're just taking the word of all of these people in Trump's cabinet and all these people involved in the foreign policy. So they're just taking their word without whatever proof. And the brazenness of this and how sloppy this whole entire coup attempt has been is honestly mind-blowing. But the media has been very diligent and brazen and just, wow. It's embarrassing, really, but definitely look into all the different sources that Blumenthal has linked in his articles, and I'm sure that other alternative media will continue to look into this. Well, that's the idea. So let me know your thoughts on it if you would like, and I hope they get power back.